By 1840, 3,000 miles of track had been laid and $75 million invested in railroad companies. Still, the railroad system was little more than a hodgepodge of unconnected tracks. But what was about to happen would change America forever. Railroad companies had a new vision, a uniquely American way of doing business. They saw themselves controlling everything, from the land the tracks were laid on, to the locomotives, to the cars, to the schedules. They would own it all.
A railroad consists of course, track, right-of-way, and that was a big chunk of property they would own. Then you would have, in certain places, you would have shops and yards. The shops, theoretically, depending on the size, they could rebuild engines, they could rebuild freight cars and passenger cars. Some of the shops had enormous facilities for doing things. A lot of the little towns had yards where they could store several other cars here and there. You had to have places where you could load freight. Then you would have all the locomotives. You would have all the freight cars, all the passenger cars. A good-sized railroad could have like nearly over 1,000 freight cars or more. And the number of passenger cars generally was smaller, generally 50 to 100 cars, depending how big the railroad was. The smaller little railroads, the ones that maybe gone 20, 30 miles up into the hills somewhere, they probably had 2 passenger cars and a dozen freight cars.
The railroad set up the middle management system. The railroad set up a similar system for their blue-collar workers, in which you have very highly defined job titles ranging from trackmen to firemen to engineer to conductor at the very top. They set up a system of financial controls so that it's not a matter of taking a few dollar bills and putting it in the cash box. It's a matter of paperwork. Every order is filled out in triplicate. The controller's office tracks the cash. Auditors track the financial system. And they do that not only to control things like theft, but much more important is to control to have a knowledge of the cash flow of the system. Where are you making a profit? So the railroads, for example, will do paperwork on every single locomotive to see how expensive it is, how much it uses in the way of oil and repair work, and how much it's operational, how much it's downtime. And locomotives that have a poor record are scrapped. So the railroad at all times has a statistical knowledge of the performance of the freight yards, of the locomotives, and of their manpower.
In short, American railroads invented cost-benefit analysis. And by the 20th century, it was practiced by every major industry in the world. The railroad's one-of-a-kind policy of being a common carrier also arose during this time. Railroads were willing to accept everything and anybody on their trains. Within reason, of course.
Well, the railroads, to get a charter from the government to do their business, are classified as common carriers. That is, they have to take all business that's offered to them. They have to publish a tariff or a schedule of their rates and their prices, and they have to stick to it.
By the 1840s, the iconic profile of the American steam locomotive appeared, and America's booming locomotive manufacturing industry was off and running, creating America's engineering excellence.
Engineering then becomes, especially locomotive engineering, the centerpiece of mechanical engineering in America. And on the other hand, bridge building and the track layout becomes the centerpiece for civil engineering in America. So civil engineering and mechanical engineering emerge as major American professions thanks to the new technologies demanded by the railroads.
The budding industry was also developing and standardizing its railroad cars, both freight and passenger.
The first use of the train was passengers because it was easy to do. You had these stagecoach-looking cars, you filled them up with people, and away you went. And it was just like a stagecoach run. Freight cars generally were a flat car, basically, and they tied down the freight. Then they slowly started making different kind of cars, like a gondola car, which could carry coal, things like that, so it wouldn't spill out everywhere. Then the box car came along a little later, just before the Civil War. And that was easier to put things in, lock it up.
By 1850, Americans had invested a whopping $300 million in railroads. New York merchants, bankers, and brokers had taken up the task of financing those railroads, replacing the financiers of Boston and Philadelphia. As a result, Wall Street became the undisputed financial center of the country.
Railroads are the first big money factor in America, and the stock market, the stock exchange, is designed primarily to handle railroad issues, railroad stocks and bonds. And as late as 1900, about 2/3 of the business on the New York Stock Exchange has to do with railroads.
Indeed, this last decade before the Civil War held the promise of large-scale, practical, and predictable rail transportation. And in fact, it became a reality by the end of the 1850s. American railroads now defined big business. A business that had laid 30,000 miles of track. No other institution was doing business on such a vast scale and financing themselves in so many different ways. Also at this time, railroad names that are now legendary in history emerged.
Hi, I'm Bill Ambrose. If you like this video, subscribe so we can bring you more programming from our studio. Thank you for subscribing.